Chapter 1. Friday, 1st February, 1811.
Master Fitzwilliam, you must come inside. It is time for luncheon.
Fitzwilliam Darcy at first ignored the words, instead swinging the axe he held back and over his head and down again in a wide circle, splitting the log on the stump perfectly in two.
"I have but a few more logs, Reynolds. I shall come in when I have finished,"
he replied, as he took up one of the halves he had just cut and prepared to half it as well. Percival Reynolds, a man near in age to Darcy's late father, who had been with the family since before he was born, stepped closer. He boldly stayed the hand that held the axe before Darcy could swing it again.
"Sir, the woodpile can wait until you've had some rest and taken some refreshment," he said firmly. "You've been out in the cold all day. It is time you should be inside and warm for a while."
Darcy opened his mouth to argue, but the expression on the old butler's face stayed his tongue. That disapproving look had long served its purpose, and even now that he was grown, he could not ignore it. Heaving a sigh, he propped the axe up against the old stump and relented.
"Very well, Reynolds. Lead on."
Reynolds stood still until Darcy moved past him with a shake of his head. The two men walked the short distance to the old cottage where they resided together with Reynolds' wife Rosemary. He felt himself scowl, as he sometimes did on approach to the place. Oh, there was nothing wrong with the two-story, four-bedroom cottage. It was snug, but a respectable dwelling. A small family or newly married couple could do very well in it, to be sure. But he was not a newly married young man. He was Fitzwilliam Darcy, the grandson of an earl, and he should not have had to make his home in a cottage with only two servants to tend him. Of course, the Reynoldses were, for all intents and purposes, not working for him. He wasn't paying them a salary to remain. They had done so purely out of loyalty and the excellent goodness of their hearts. As the old Pemberley butler had declared on their vacating of the estate house,
"We go where our master goes, sir."
This had been followed by his wife's teary,
"Your family has always been so good to us, Mr. Darcy. We could not in good conscience betray that generosity by abandoning you in your hour of need."
A feeling of deepest gratitude had filled him then. They had stood with him as he said an emotional goodbye to his sister, who was taken in by his uncle, the present Earl of Disley, to be raised alongside his young daughter Cecilia. They had taken on the duty of laying cloths over every portrait and piece of furniture in the house, had been with him when he locked the doors to Pemberley for the last time, with no idea when they might be free to open them again. It had been almost 5 years since they had been forced to abandon the ancestral home of the Darcy family, which had for centuries been a place of honor and prestige. Every day of that 5 years he had cursed the name Wickham, for it was his old childhood friend and his father, the latter of whom had once been trusted with the management of the estate, who had forced Darcy to give his sister into the care of others while he had to make do with a cottage on the grounds rather than the home of his youth.
"Good afternoon, Master Fitzwilliam. Percy, my dear,"
said Mrs. Reynolds as the two men entered the house. As expected, the table in their small dining parlour had already been laid out with cakes, biscuits, fruits, and cold meats. A steaming pot of tea sat centre of it all. Darcy marvelled, as he often did, that she could manage it all without cook to help her, but the one time he'd asked, she'd sharply reminded him of where she had started her service to the family. Mrs. Reynolds had initially been a kitchen maid, had even served as cook for a few years, before moving into the more eminently respectable position of housekeeper. After discarding his outerwear, Darcy stepped over to the washstand to clean his hands and face, then took a seat at the table. He was soon joined by the two servants, and a short grace was said before Mrs. Reynolds poured and served tea to each of them. They consumed the repast in silence, as was their habit, and were about finished near 20 minutes later when the sound of an approaching carriage drew their attention. carriages did not approach this cottage. It was rather out of the way of the other tenants, which was what Darcy had wanted. The seclusion suited him, as his pride had been deeply wounded by having to give up the estate house and live as though he were one of his tenants. Though the last few years had served well in humbling him, making him more compassionate as regarded the lower classes who had heretofore helped make his life so very comfortable, he rarely associated with them. Thus, for the most part, only the Reynolds suffered his mortification alongside him. Stepping outside, flanked by his most loyal people, Darcy watched the approach of a small carriage. He recognized the livery of the driver, though he wore heavy outer garments to ward off the chill of winter. What could his uncle want to speak to him about that would bring him all this way in person? Lord Disley usually sent a single footman on horseback to deliver any messages. Georgiana, he thought, feeling alarm shoot through him. His sister. Something had happened to his sister. Dear God, was she hurt? Was she? No, he would not go there. When at last the two-horse equipage came to a stop, Darcy immediately stepped up to it. No one exited the carriage, but the driver did climb down from the box. It was a young man, his own age, whose face he recognized, but whose name he could not at present recall. The young man bowed, which told that he had been recognized in return, a surprise given his rather dishevelled state. Darcy had learned quickly that function over fashion was key to maintaining one's home and land with his own hands. "Good afternoon, Mr. Darcy," said the carriage driver as he reached into his jacket and pulled out a sealed letter. "As you may have guessed, sir, I have come on behalf of the Earl of Disley." "So I gathered," Darcy replied in a droll tone as he broke the seal and unfolded the note. "Disley Court, 1st February. Dear nephew, I hope this note finds you in good health and spirits. All here at the court are well, and, as I know it will bring you comfort, know that Georgiana continues to excel in her studies. She is absolutely remarkable at the pianoforte, and her cousin excels at singing. She and Cecilia complement each other most excellently when they perform. They are as close as sisters could be, and do everything together. But you do not want to be told things which you already know. I am sending the girl's carriage to bring you to Cheshire, as there is a matter I wish to discuss with you regarding Pemberley. I think it is best done in person. I shall expect your arrival by supper. Sincerest regards, Disley." Pemberley? What could the Earl have to say about the estate? Had he found the Wickhams, or the massive Darcy fortune they had managed to purloin with their lies and trickery? Unlikely, he mused bitterly. After all, it had been nearly 5 long years, and nary a trace had been found of either. "I will prepare your trunk, sir," said Reynolds, though he had not seen the note. "I will lay out a change of clothes for you," added Mrs. Reynolds, and she followed her husband into the house. The presence of an entire carriage was enough to tell the two servants that he had been summoned. Darcy just stopped himself, telling them not to bother. After all, it wasn't as though his uncle was unaware of how he lived. He'd been offered the chance of joining Georgiana in removing to Disley Court, but had declined. His pride would not allow him to run away. Pemberley was his home, and he would not abandon it completely. "There must always be a Darcy at Pemberley," he'd said, quoting an old family saying. Stifling a sigh, he looked to the carriage driver. Marcus, that was his name. The footman was his younger brother, Robert, and said, "I should not be long. You and Robert must come inside. Mrs. Reynolds will see that you have tea to warm you while you wait." "Thank you, Mr. Darcy. Most obliging," said Marcus, who gestured to his brother before following Darcy into the house. Darcy encountered Mrs. Reynolds on the landing to the 1st floor. "Please see to some tea for the coachman, if you would." Mrs. Reynolds merely smiled and nodded, and allowed him to pass her in the narrow space before she continued to the ground floor. As he entered his room, he found her husband just closing a small trunk. Clean attire was laid out on the bed.
"As we've no notion of how long you'll be away, sir, "I've packed 3 days' worth of your good clothing for you," said Reynolds. "I'll take this down and see to putting it in the carriage."
"See to it that the horses have some water as well, if it's not too much trouble," Darcy added as he moved to sit in a chair in the corner and remove his dusty boots. A clean pair sat next to the bed. As Reynolds helped him with tending the few animals they had on their small plot of land, he would doubtless comply with the request.
"Of course, sir,"
was all he said as he picked up the trunk and headed out with it. Darcy made quick work of changing and making himself more presentable. Glancing in the small looking-glass over the washstand, he noted that he needed a shave, and his hair could certainly do with a trim, but those were hardly reasons to delay setting out. The Earl would just have to put up with his having 4 days' growth of beard, and hair long enough at the back to brush his shoulders. On his reappearance downstairs, the 2 coachmen immediately stood. They quickly thanked Mrs. Reynolds for the tea and headed out the front door. Darcy walked up to her as her husband stepped inside. "I can't imagine what my uncle has to say that he could not have relayed on paper, but you can be sure I will inform you as soon as may be done," Darcy said.
"May I be so bold as to ask what the note you were given said, sir?" asked Reynolds.
"Little, beyond that the Earl had need to speak to me about Pemberley, and that it was best done in person," Darcy replied.
"I shouldn't dare hope he'll allow us to open the house again," said Mrs. Reynolds. "If he's not been able to support keeping it open all these years, I doubt we'll get to move the master back home again."
The lady flushed then as her eyes flicked up to meet Darcy's.
"I do beg your pardon, Master Fitzwilliam. I should not speak of Lord Disley so. I know he's been very generous to take your dear sister in and supply you with an allowance."
Supply me with a pittance? Darcy thought bitterly of the 500 a year he'd been allotted, then drew a breath and released it slowly. He could not be angry with his uncle, who had done all within his power just to keep the estate from falling into the hands of another, whilst seeing to the management of his own vast holdings. He and his wife had indeed been generous in being so willing to take Georgiana into their home and raise her along with their young daughter, despite the scandal that broke when word got out that George Darcy had been swindled by his steward and lost nearly everything. "It's quite all right, Mrs. Reynolds," Darcy assured her, though he agreed silently that it was unlikely his uncle wanted to talk about reopening the house. What he could wish to speak to him about, he had not the slightest idea. It was a long and boring northwest journey. Darcy began to wish after the first hour that he'd at least brought along a book to read while there was light, but it had not occurred to him, and so there was nothing to distract him from wondering as to the true purpose of the summons. They stopped twice for an hour each time to rest the horses and refresh themselves. Darcy wished it wasn't necessary, but the animals weren't simple post horses that could be changed out in a quarter of an hour for a fresh pair at a coaching inn. They belonged to his uncle. A sigh of relief escaped him when at last they pulled up to the stone edifice of Disley Court. Torches were lit at intervals along the outer wall, and he knew there would be more lighting the small stone courtyard beyond. Darcy resisted the urge to stretch when at last he had alighted from the vehicle and headed directly into the courtyard, leaving the footman to deal with his single piece of luggage. The front door opened before he had chance to knock to reveal Somerset. He had served the Disleys as butler at the court about as long as Reynolds had been in the Darcy's service. The servant's quick response told Darcy that someone had been watching for him.
"Good evening, Mr. Darcy,"
said the butler with a sniff through his thin nose. Probably thinks I should have taken the time to have a shave and a haircut, Darcy thought, and he just resisted the urge to smirk at the man.
"This way, if you please, sir,"
Somerset said, then turned about smartly and led the way to the drawing-room. There he found not only his uncle, who was reading a newspaper, but also his aunt, his youngest cousin, and his sister. "Fitzwilliam!" Georgiana cried instantly on seeing him, then jumped up and ran over to throw her arms around him. Darcy returned the embrace tightly, eliciting a squeal from his sister. God, but it felt good to hold her in his arms. It had been far too long, well over a year since he had last seen her. A gentle clearing of her throat from the Countess reminded the two that they were not alone. Holding Georgiana back from him, his hands resting on her shoulders, Darcy took a good long look at her as he said, "Bless my soul, it does me good to see you, dearest." She'd grown so much since last year. Already the top of her head reached his shoulder at only 15. She had filled out, too, as girls were wont to do, and a surge of protectiveness rose within him at the thought of her receiving unwanted attention from males in the area.
"It does me good to see you as well, brother," said Georgiana. "You've been away far too long."
"I have," he agreed. "I am sorry to make you miss me so. But rest assured, dear one, I have missed you a great deal as well." Darcy lifted his head to find his aunt and uncle looking at him expectantly. He bowed his head to each in turn and offered a greeting, then looked to his youngest Fitzwilliam cousin, Cecilia. "Good evening, cousin."
"Good evening to you, cousin,"
said the young lady, who bore such a resemblance to her mother that the two might well be mistaken for sisters. Darcy walked further into the room with Georgiana's hand in his eyes on the Earl. "Lord Disley, I believe you wished to see me about a matter regarding Pemberley."
"Pemberley?"
queried Georgiana, who looked to their uncle with a quizzical expression.
"I had no idea. Uncle Richard only said that he was expecting you by supper."
Lord Disley pulled a fob watch from his pocket. "Speaking of, it is about time for it," said he, just as the housekeeper entered and announced the late evening meal was ready. The Earl folded his paper and set it aside as the three ladies headed out of the room. When he had stood, he stepped over to Darcy and said, "Let us have a pleasant meal with your aunt and the girls. Business can wait until tomorrow, I dare say." As if he had any choice in the matter. Biting back a retort about having been summoned and then made to wait, Darcy gave a curt nod and followed his uncle into the small dining room, where the five of them sat down to a hearty beef stew. Georgiana and Cecilia regaled him with tales of their studies. Both were becoming highly accomplished, with his sister preferring to play and his cousin to sing when it came to music. Lady Disley made a point of praising their needlework, noting that Georgiana's embroidery skills were most impressive, and her husband then praised their daughter in lauding her skill with a paintbrush.
"We'll be happy to show you some of our work later, if you like," said Cecilia. "It's late, Cersei. After supper, you and Georgiana will be heading to your rooms," said her mother.
"Indeed. Your cousin is likely fatigued from his journey," added her father, "and no doubt desires a well-earned rest."
What I desire is getting to the point of this excursion, Darcy thought sourly. Surely his uncle knew what anxieties he would have suffered on the road, wondering what he could possibly have to say about Pemberley that was best said in person. When supper was done, Darcy escorted his sister to her room, which was connected by a sitting room to Cecilia's. Their cousin walked ahead of them. Georgiana chattered all the way, telling him more about her studies. She was enjoying learning Italian and the horse that she had been gifted by their uncle for her 15th birthday.
"I believe I must have written you about dear Belle many times, but truly, Fitzwilliam, she's an angel of a mare, so gentle and so perfectly bred to carry a lady. And oh, the stunning colour of her coat."
"The most incredible shade of brown, such as you are reminded of chocolate," he finished for her. Georgiana laughed as they stopped outside her door.
"I see I have spoken to you of her. Well, you shall see for yourself tomorrow, I'm sure. We should go for a ride together. You know that Theodore has a horse here still. I overhear the grooms all the time saying how it's a shame he doesn't get the same attention Cecilia and I give our horses."
Darcy indulged in a wistful smile. He had heard of the horse she spoke of, as it had been Theo's great joy to have secured the black beast's purchase. It was a shame indeed that their uncle could not see to the stallions being exercised more often. "I shall be glad to ride with you, Georgiana," he said. "I don't get to ride for pleasure very often." Her countenance revealed, for a fraction of a moment, how very sad his words made her. Darcy's pride in her rose when she almost instantly returned his steady gaze with a wide smile.
Well, you shall tomorrow. Cecilia and I usually ride together in the mornings, but she does also like to lie abed later than usual on Saturday, so it is like to be just the two of us. And it is likely to be cold in the morning anyway, but we can bundle ourselves quite well and ensure at least half an hour's ride, I think.
Darcy knew this already from her many letters over the years, but said nothing as he smiled indulgently. Well, if she decides to ride with us, I shan't mind at all. I've not spent enough time with either of you in these last 18 months.
I do wish Theodore were here. We could have Philip and Sophia and little Julian come over from Roworth Hall and have a whole family party.
Not Lady Catherine and Anne as well? Darcy teased. Georgiana emitted a soft snort.
He would be gone by the time they arrived, she said primly. Not to mention a family party wouldn't be near half as fun if they were here,
cried Cecilia, who peeked out from the sitting-room doorway.
Come, Georgie, let's do a little work on our matching reticules before we're ready for bed. Coming, Ceci,
Georgiana replied, then reached out to her brother and embraced him again.
It really is good to see you, brother,
she murmured against his chest. And you as well, dear one, Darcy replied as he returned the embrace, then released her and pushed her gently toward their cousin. When the door was closed behind the two girls, he turned away and started for the guest wing. His aunt and uncle were just coming up the stairs then, and Lady Disley asked,
Where are you going, Fitzwilliam?
I am a guest. I assume my room is in the guest wing, he replied flatly.
Balderdash, boy, cried his uncle. Do not tell me that 5 years in the sun as a tenant on your own bloody estate has addled that brain of yours.
Wretched language, admonished his wife softly. To Darcy she said,
Though I do not care for how he said it, I do agree with what your uncle said. You're a fool indeed if you seriously believed we'd put you in guest quarters. You are family, Fitzwilliam. Your room is in the family wing. In fact, it is the same room you always occupied whenever you stayed with us before.
Darcy forced himself to relax. It had been so long since anyone but the Reynolds had treated him as one of their own. Of course, his exile had been of his own imposition. The Earl, Philip, and even Theodore, to whom he had once been as close as a brother, had mostly left him alone, as he had requested. He'd done it because he'd not wanted them to see how far he had sunk in the world, nor would his pride allow him to be reminded of what he had lost whenever he was in their presence. Releasing a breath, he said, Forgive me, Aunt, Uncle. I'm sure it is merely exhaustion, which has muddled my thoughts. His aunt stepped up to him and took his hands in hers. Then go on to bed, dearest, and get yourself a good night's rest. Probably a better one than you'll ever get in that cottage your uncle says you live in. As he had gotten used to the stiff, unyielding rope bed he'd been forced to accept upon his relocation to the cottage, Darcy thought it more likely that sleeping on the soft feather mattress that awaited him in his room was more likely to cause restlessness than abate it. He kept the thought to himself, however, and leaned to place a kiss upon his aunt's brow, then offered a nod to his uncle before he turned back the way he had come. Like Georgiana and Cecilia's rooms, his was one of a suite, and shared a sitting room with his cousin Theodore's bedchamber. It had once been Philip's room when his elder cousins were young boys, but a significant row between them had led to Philip's demanding a separate suite. As Darcy and Theodore had always gotten along better than the brothers, though they now loved and respected each other as much as a pair of brothers could do, they were paired together whenever the Darcy family visited Disley Court as soon as he had graduated from the nursery. In contrast to his assumption, however, the physical and mental exertions of the day led to Darcy falling asleep soon after his head hit the pillow. Chapter 2. Friday, 1st February, 1811.
Lizzie, I cannot do this any more.
ElizabethBennet lifted her head to gaze with some concern toward her elder sister Jane Bingley, who stood at the drawing-room window glancing forlornly out into the rainy day. So absorbed in her book had she been that she'd not even noticed Jane had put aside the gown she'd been embroidering for her daughter, let alone moved from the sofa. Placing a ribbon between the pages to mark her place, Elizabeth stood and moved to her sister's side.
Can't do what, Jane?
She asked softly.
This,
Jane replied, gesturing out the window before she turned and gestured again to the room they occupied.
or this.
A sigh escaped her as she turned once more to the misty, wet prospect beyond Netherfield's window.
I've been out of mourning a week, Lizzie, just a week, and already Mamma has suggested I go to town for the season to find a new father for Margaret.
Shock seized Elizabeth's tongue for half a minute before she sputtered indignantly,
How abominably thoughtless of her.
She then slipped an arm about Jane's waist and laid her head to her sister's shoulder.
I am so sorry, Jane, that Mamma and her foolishness have upset you so.
Elizabeth sympathized with Jane's distress. The eldest Bennet daughter had loved Charles Bingley with all her heart, and they had been married just 2 years when he'd taken ill with such a dreadful infection of the lungs that he had been unable to recover. Jane Bennet Bingley was made a widow at only 22 years of age, and their infant daughter Margaret had lost a father she would never remember. Lady Bennet had for many years been certain of Jane's angelic beauty securing her a very wealthy husband, and she had not been disappointed on learning that the young gentleman from the north, who'd leased the vacant estate just 3 miles from their own, was wealthy, single, and in want of a wife. Charles and Jane were married by Christmas that year, and Margaret, named for her father's dearly departed mother, had arrived the following autumn. The girl's mother had been further hopeful that Jane's marrying a man of 5,000 a year would throw her sisters in the path of other rich men, but dear Charles had disappointed her there. Once settled in the country with his new wife, he declared that he was quite content to stay there the whole year round. Few of his wealthy friends were invited to Netherfield throughout his marriage, much to Lady Bennet's vexation, and what sojourns he made to town were solely for business purposes. He always went alone, and he always returned in a day or 2. It galled Elizabeth that her mother could be so insensitive to Jane's feelings. She just wasn't ready to move on. But Lady Bennet was remiss to recollect that Charles's fortune, a combination of his inheritance and Netherfield's rents, had been left unencumbered to Jane and Margaret, much to the vexation of his sisters, Caroline Bingley and Louisa Bingley Hurst, who had each received only family heirlooms upon their brother's death. Caroline had also been granted control of her inheritance of £20,000. Because of this remarkable legacy, Jane had not only the Netherfield estate, but also a house in London, and enough wealth that she did not need a husband's income to support herself and her daughter. In fact, with Bingley's 8,000 a year now being her own, Jane herself was quite the catch. To that end, Elizabeth was little surprised that her mother hoped to get her sister into town for the season. Wealth attracted wealth, and no doubt Lady Bennet had hopes of a second rich husband doing for her other 4 daughters what Jane's first had not. Also, because Jane had married at 20, their mother had decided that Elizabeth should also, and greatly disappointed was she to have been unsuccessful in that endeavour, as her second daughter would be 21 in just 6 weeks. Right in the middle of the London season. No doubt Lady Bennet was already planning her wardrobe, that she might take her to town and finally marry off her most troublesome child, that she could begin readying the third for her debut. Recalling Jane's words, Elizabeth asked her,
What did you mean, dearest, when you said you couldn't do this any more? I mean to leave Netherfield, Lizzie,
Jane replied. Elizabeth stood straight.
Leave Netherfield? So you mean to go to London after all?
Jane shook her head.
No, not to London. Mamma would find me out and harangue me about taking part in the season. I could not bear it.
She moved away from the window then and went back to her seat on the sofa. Elizabeth followed and returned to her chair.
Then where do you mean to go? Be assured I have given the matter a great deal of thought this last year.
Jane began slowly as she picked up the unfinished toddler gown and held it in her lap.
The truth of the matter is there are far too many memories of Charles here for me to remain. It has become so painful to move about in this house that at times I find I cannot even breathe. Thus, I have decided to seek an estate elsewhere. I mean to consult with Father as soon as the weather permits travel.
Elizabeth frowned.
So, you will give up
Netherfield. She almost couldn't believe it. Charles Bingley had only leased the estate when he'd first come into the neighbourhood near 3 years and a half ago, but as soon as he'd learned Jane was with child, he'd purchased it outright. It was to have been their home, where he could lay down the roots of gentrification for his offspring, as his father had hoped for him, and from where she could raise those children but still be close to her beloved family. Jane had been so enamoured of being mistress of so fine an estate, Elizabeth could hardly think of the place and not associate Jane with it.
I think I shall lease it, perhaps,
Jane replied to her query.
Or maybe I ought to offer it to our parents. In any case, I should like to keep the house for Margaret's sake. She'll not have to be concerned for a home if she should decide never to marry, and I may well return in a year or two and live out my days here. It's just that, for now...
Her voice broke as tears filled her eyes. Jane brought the gown to her face and cried into it as Elizabeth moved again to her side to embrace her.
For now it is too much for you,
she said softly, and felt Jane nod.
I do understand, Jane, and at risk of emulating Mary, as Ruth begged of Naomi, entreat me not to leave thee or to return from following after thee, for whither thou goest, I will go. Where thou lodgest, I will lodge.
When Jane looked up at her with a teary, visibly relieved gaze, Elizabeth smiled.
I could not leave my most beloved sister to face the wide world alone, now could I?
Jane threw her arms around her and held her tight.
I have been wanting to ask you, and so afraid to at the same time. Forgive me for being so dependent on you now, Lizzie, when you are yet full young and have not known life outside of Longbourn.
Elizabeth returned the embrace.
Jane, there is nothing to forgive. You are still mourning your husband, no matter that society thinks you ought to have done with it by now, let alone our marriage-obsessed mother, and you will need help, not only with your home but with Meg. It is my honour to be of what assistance to you I can be.
The next day, on seeing that the rain had eased and the sun was shining through what clouds remained, Jane saw to Margaret's needs before she and Elizabeth set off in the carriage for the 3-mile journey to Longbourn. They would arrive in time to break their fast with the family. Afterward, Jane would speak to their father about searching for a new home. As the Bingley carriage trundled along, Elizabeth considered what her father's reaction would be. She did not believe he would object overmuch. After all, Jane was past the age of majority, and she had a sensible head on her shoulders. She'd been married and had spent the whole of her widowhood almost entirely on her own. Elizabeth had stayed with her often, of course, and various other family members had made occasional 2- or 3-day visits. Their aunt, Mrs. Gardiner, had stayed an entire fortnight just after Charles's death just to tend Margaret, who'd just turned a year old 4 months prior, as Jane had been inconsolable those first weeks and had barely risen from her bed. The only real concern Sir Thomas might have with the plan was Elizabeth's joining her sister in moving away. Though Jane could certainly be trusted as a guardian, the latter was the baronet's favourite child, and parting with her would be difficult for him. The first objective, Elizabeth mused, would be gaining their father's blessing. The second would be convincing their mother to accept that the decision was not hers to make. The third would be locating a suitable home to reside in. On this matter, she was sure their mother would make her opinion known. Only an estate would do if Jane was determined to avoid town. It need not be so large as Netherfield, but the daughters and granddaughter of a baronet would absolutely not be allowed to lower themselves so far as to reside in a cottage. The former Mr. Bennet's elevation to a baronetcy some 15 years prior had given an already silly woman with weak understanding and an illiberal mind more airs than she was perhaps entitled to, But one could not convince Lady Bennet that she thought her family more important than they truly were. After all, her husband's title had been bestowed upon him by request of Prince Edward himself. Shortly before the youngest of their 5 daughters was born, Mr. Bennet had been elected mayor in Meryton, the market town nearest their estate. To amuse his wife during her confinement, he made an address to the king, though without expecting any response. Quite surprised, then, was he to receive one, and as soon as Mrs. Bennet was out of her lying-in following Lydia's entrance into the family circle, they made for London for his presentation. He'd expected little more notice than to receive a trifling knighthood. However, upon discovering him to be the same Thomas Bennet with whom he had been engaging in an ongoing private war of chess by post for some years, Prince Edward had declared that a man of such intelligence and wit as he possessed deserved greater reward than a mere knighthood. It was then announced that he had convinced their majesties to bestow upon him a baronetcy and a small fortune of £20,000. "How very necessary was that fortune, Lizzie," her father had once said, "for it enabled me to provide you and your sisters dowries which you would not otherwise have had." Ever since their place in society had risen, Jane Gardner Bennet had ceased to be overly concerned about the entail preventing Longbourns being passed to one of her husband's children, for surely £5,000 each and a titled father would attract many a wealthy gentleman. Jane had successfully fulfilled her mother's dreams for her by capturing the attentions of the very young Mr. Charles Bingley. So, Lady Bennet expected similar matches were to be found for the younger girls in turn. As such, no daughter of hers would be allowed to live in a house meant for poor relations or tenants to reside in.
"We'll have to find an estate, you know," said Elizabeth aloud as the carriage turned up the drive to their childhood home. "Indeed," Jane concurred. "Mamma would never abide our taking only a cottage. A baronet's daughters should be seen." "To be living like a baronet's daughters," Elizabeth finished with a grin. The two were greeted warmly by Mrs. Hill, the long-time Longbourn housekeeper, when they entered the front hall. Soon their youngest sisters, Catherine, whom the family called Kitty, and Lydia, came excitedly down the stairs, followed at a more sedate pace by the middle Bennet girl, Mary. The 5 sisters greeted each other with smiles, kisses, and embraces, as though it had not been only a few days since last they'd seen one another. The noise soon drew the attention of Lady Bennet, who was as profuse with her praise of Jane as was her habit, before she then scolded her for not bringing Margaret along. "Why would you deny me a visit with my only grandchild?" the lady asked indignantly. "I have denied you nothing, Mamma," Jane replied calmly. "Meg is hardly of an age to be making morning calls, and you know you are perfectly welcome to come to Netherfield and see her any time."
"Well," said Lady Bennet with a laugh, "you can be sure I will at the earliest opportunity. I have been so very busy of late, you know. I'm always visiting this neighbour or that, to show the charity and compassion the wife of a baronet ought to bestow upon her fellow man." Elizabeth only just stopped herself, rolling her eyes in a very unladylike fashion at her mother's pompous remark, which was really a euphemism for going about town and gossiping with her friends, though her restraint hardly proved necessary, as Lady Bennet had already turned away to lead them into the dining-room. Breakfast passed pleasantly for about 10 minutes, until the lady of the house said to her eldest daughter, "So, my dearest Jane, when would you care to begin planning your season? Margaret needs a father, and I'm very sure your beauty and fortune will attract many admirers to your drawing-room in Grosvenor Square." Before a startled Jane could even respond, Lady Bennet continued with, "Of course we must take Lizzie with us. She is almost 21 already, and has also not had a proper debut. You know I cannot bring Mary out in London without having the 2 of you married. Oh, for shame, I could not do it." Elizabeth was stunned by how oblivious her mother was to how much her talk upset Jane, and looked to her father to see if he would speak up on her sister's behalf. Imploring him to act proved unnecessary, however, as Jane herself took up her own defence. "Mamma, I shall not be going to town for the season," said she, in a voice that only just shook. Lady Bennet's eyes widened. "Not go to London? Not go to London? But of course you must go. How else will you find another husband if you do not?" Jane drew a breath, and Elizabeth's pride in her rose as her sister sat straighter, looked her mother in the eye, and said,
I do not want another husband, Mother. Not at this time, for my heart is still held by Charles. Further, I intend to remove from Netherfield and find another home for Meg and me.
Lady Bennet gasped. Mary's eyebrows rose toward her hairline, and Kitty and Lydia giggled, as they were wont to do whenever their governess wasn't around. Taking advantage of her mother's shocked silence, Jane turned to Sir Thomas.
Papa, now that the subject has been brought up, I should like to say that I intended to seek your counsel after breakfast, as well as your permission for Lizzie to come and live with me in my new home.
No! All eyes turned to Lady Bennet. Jane Bennet Bingley, I forbid you to take my granddaughter out of the only home she has ever known and away from her only grandmamma. And how can you be so cruel as to deny your sisters the chance to marry as well as you did? You know I cannot marry the rest of them off if you are not.
Firstly, Mamma, you cannot forbid me from taking my daughter anywhere,
said Jane, with a hint of fire in her voice.
Secondly, I have already been married. That will be enough for the society matrons you desire so much to become acquainted with, as well as their husbands and the sons to whom you hope to marry your younger daughters.
The rapid blinking of her eyes was Lady Bennet's initial response. Then she sniffed, raised her nose a little higher, and said, Ungrateful child! Oh, you have no compassion for my poor nerves. Do as you will, then. Ruin your daughter's future at your peril by staying from town to find a new father to protect her. But I'll not allow you to ruin your sister's chances, young lady. You shall not be taking Elizabeth wherever it is you mean to run off to. Oh, my nerves, do you see what you've done? Such flutterings and spasms I have all over me. Oh, do please control yourself, Lady Bennet, spoke up Sir Thomas at last. Jane is not being an ungrateful child just because she refuses to bend to your whims, my dear. She is well within her rights to both refrain from visiting London, which I commend you for, Jane, as you well know my thoughts on that subject, and to remove with her daughter to any place of residence she should wish. As to Elizabeth's joining her, that is for me to decide. Now, my daughters, he went on, turning his attention to Jane and Elizabeth, shall we retire to my study to discuss? The baronet did not wait for their response. He simply rose and took his leave and expected them to follow. Neither minded. The sisters stood in silent unison and departed to the sound of their youngest siblings twittering madly and their mother sputtering nonsensically about betrayal and ill usage in her own family. Sir Thomas's study was perhaps the only room within Longbourn that was not kept immaculately tidy. Oh, the housekeeper herself came in to dust and tidy up every day, but he was such a collector of books and maps that every available surface had been taken up by them. There were books, even on the two visitors' chairs that sat before his desk, which his two daughters had to move before they could make themselves comfortable. So, Jane, you truly mean to give up Netherfield? Sir Thomas asked when they were all settled. Jane cleared her throat delicately, and Elizabeth noted colour in her cheeks. The poor dear had always been just a little intimidated by their father.
Yes, Papa, she replied. That is, I do mean to move out and live elsewhere. I have no plans to sell the estate. I mean to keep it for Margaret, that she may be assured of a home if I should marry again.
The baronet nodded slowly. A very wise decision, my dear. It seems you have given the matter much thought. Jane inclined her head as well.
I have, sir. In the interim, I have thought to let the estate or to offer residence to you, Mamma, and my sisters. Even before Mamma first spoke of my marrying again last week, I had decided to seek your advice. My heart is just too full of grief and memories of my husband for me to remain comfortable in our home. I need to get away, at least for a while.
And you are certain London does not appeal to you?
It does not, sir. I confess that I dread the very idea, said Jane. I have always lived in the country. I find that normally being surrounded by nature relaxes me. And I dare say it is a more pleasant and healthy environment for a young child than town.
Sir Thomas chuckled. Indeed it is. His eyes then flicked to Elizabeth. What say you, Lizzie? Do you approve of Jane's plan? Elizabeth glanced briefly at her sister before replying,
I do not think it my place to approve or not, Papa. Jane is a woman grown. She has been a wife, is a mother, and more, she knows her own mind. If she is determined to go, I dare say we cannot stop her. Or rather, we should not.
And does her wish to have you accompany her on this removal from Netherfield appeal to you? Her father pressed. She chanced to smile.
It does indeed, sir. I should very much like to be of use to my sister in any way I am able.
So you've no desire for a season in town?
Elizabeth laughed. Oh, Papa, while I can imagine it would be delightful to attend many balls and parties, I do not wish to parade myself about in the hopes of securing a rich husband. I'm not yet 21. Only Mamma is distressed by my being older than Jane was when she married dear Charles. At present, I have no desire to turn my mind to matrimony.
Sir Thomas seemed almost relieved to hear her speak so, and smiled as he said, Very wisely spoken, Lizzie. He sighed then and sat back in his chair, lacing his fingers over his slightly protruding middle as his expression turned contemplative. I imagine that removal from Netherfield means also removal from the neighbourhood, so Purvis Lodge is out of the question, as is the great house at Stoke.
Elizabeth laughed again. Mamma could never abide the attics at Purvis Lodge, for she has already declared them dreadful, and the drawing-rooms at Stoke are not large enough for her taste.
But it is not your mother's tastes we must appeal to, Sir Thomas rejoined, though he grinned as he said it. His eyes then looked to Jane again, and when next he spoke there was a hint of emotion in his voice. My dear girl, I do understand your need to get away. Thus I will not only offer my blessing, but my assistance in locating a suitable home for you. And Lizzie may join you, as it is your express wish as well as hers.
Jane's relief was obvious. She blinked away tears as she rose and went around the desk to embrace him before kissing his cheek and saying, Oh, thank you, Papa. I cannot tell you how grateful I am for your understanding.
Sir Thomas patted her arm. Well, now we've got the two of you sorted, I shall begin sending out inquiries on Monday. In the meantime, I will work to convince your mother it was all her idea in the first place. Only then shall any of us have peace.
Chapter 3. Darcy found himself awake at 6 the next morning. This was not an unusual time for him to rise, for there was always something to be done about the few acres of land he inhabited. Sometimes he would offer his assistance to a neighbouring tenant if there was a need for extra hands for the building of a fence or repairs to a roof. Once he'd spent an entire day on a neighbour's farm helping to build a new barn. Though he often let his beard grow out to disguise himself, since he saw no one of his old circle of acquaintances, his neighbours knew who he was. They knew what had happened to his father, his fortune, his dignity. None of this was ever mentioned. The tenants were grateful to him for ensuring they would not lose their own homes in the wake of the disaster that had befallen his family, and they respected him more than ever for being willing to humble himself and live at their level. It was well known that he could have joined his sister at the home of his lofty relatives, the Earl and Countess of Disley, the Earl now having management over Pemberley Park, but had chosen to remain close to the home that had been his from the day of his birth. He had not abandoned the people who had for so long made a piece of the park their homes. After completing his morning ablutions, he dressed in one of the suits that Reynolds had packed for him, a pair of black breeches and a brown waistcoat and jacket. He was supposed to go riding with his sister, but had no riding breeches or boots with him, so what he had would have to do. He was just tying his cravat when there was a knock at his door.
Half expecting his uncle, he opened it to find not the Earl, but his valet on the other side. "Does Lord Disley have need of me?" he asked. Perkins shook his head and lifted his hand. Darcy took note of a towel folded over his arm, with a mug in his hand that held a brush, a razor, and a pair of scissors. "No, sir," said the valet. "Lord Disley thought that perhaps you might like a shave and a haircut."
"It's more likely his lordship desired his nephew not to go about the grounds looking like a wolf in sheep's clothing,"
Darcy muttered, though he stepped aside and allowed the man to enter, wondering how his uncle could possibly have known he would be awake at this hour. He wordlessly took himself to the chair at the dressing-table and sat in it as Perkins arrayed the few instruments he'd brought on the table's top. He then moved to the washstand and poured a draught of water into the mug, which Darcy knew would have a chunk of soap at the bottom. On his return, Perkins unfolded the towel and put it about his chest and shoulders. The long-serving valet made quick work of trimming his hair to a more respectable, shorter length before he went to work on clearing the beard from his chin. Afterward, Darcy was forced to admit that he both looked and felt better, more like his old self, though he knew it would not last long. Thanking Perkins for his time and praising the excellence of his work, he then quit his room to go in search of his uncle. Surely the Earl was up if his valet was already at work. He found the older man, not unsurprisingly, in his study. The clock on the mantel over the fireplace read 7, and he still wore a flannel banyan.
"Ah, Fitzwilliam, I see that Perkins has done his duty,"
Richard Fitzwilliam remarked on bidding him entrance. "Indeed, you need not be embarrassed to be seen with me now," Darcy remarked. Lord Disley frowned.
"Fitzwilliam, there's no need to be unpleasant. I know you haven't a man of your own right now."
"I have Reynolds," Darcy rejoined. "He does well enough in lieu of a proper valet, though, given my living situation, I see no need to waste time having him shave me every morning or trim my hair every month. Those are, at present, luxuries I can do without."
"You chose to stay behind and live as your tenants do,"
his uncle reminded him needlessly. "On the contrary, uncle, there was no choice," said Darcy. "Not for me. Perhaps you would understand how I feel if our situations were reversed."
"Perhaps I would. But that is a moot point, one which we have argued countless times over the last 5 years," said the Earl with a sigh. "I did not ask you here to debate the merits of your choice. I sent Perkins to you because I thought I might do you a kindness while you were here, not because I was ashamed of your appearance."
"You didn't ask me here, uncle. You said you expected me by supper, which I believe qualifies as a summons," Darcy pointed out. Lord Disley frowned again and sat back in his chair.
"Might I ask why you are behaving so churlishly?"
Darcy scoffed. "Need you really ask? You demanded I come and then made me wait for an explanation as to why. Then you had your man tend me this morning as though you could not stand the sight of me. You reminded me that I chose the life I now live, as though I am not reminded of it every single day, and though we have argued the necessity of that choice countless times, you still fail to understand why I made it. Pemberley is all that I have left, and I don't even really have that. You do." He emitted a groan born of exasperation and annoyance. "I just don't understand how you cannot see what it means to me, both to remain at the park and to live with the knowledge that Pemberley is yours and not mine." An expression he could not decipher had fallen over his uncle's face, and when at last Darcy had finished speaking, the Earl sighed heavily.
"I suppose you are right," he said at last. "I cannot truly understand because I have never been put in the position to have to make the choice you did. But I can imagine, Fitzwilliam. I can imagine the humiliation, the loss of pride and dignity you suffer. I can imagine how much it hurt you to lose your father in the manner he left us, to place your only sibling into the custody of others to care for."
He sat forward then, his hands clasped together on the desktop and his gaze now earnest.
"I hope that one day you will know how very, very proud I am of the man you have chosen to be. I don't know that I could be such a man. I'm too used to this life, too old and set in my ways to so easily give it up for a cottage in a distant corner of my own estate."
Disley then gestured to the chair that sat before his desk. Drawing a breath, Darcy moved at last to take it, expelling the breath he'd held in a whoosh as he fell back into it.
"Please, believe me when I say that it pains me more than you will ever know to have to sit by and do almost nothing for you," his uncle continued. "I have, honestly, done all that I can these last 5 years."
Feeling suddenly ashamed of his behavior, Darcy nodded. "I know you have, Uncle. Forgive me for being such an ungracious oaf. Sometimes the weight of, well, everything just crashes down upon me and I lash out when I should instead be silent." His uncle nodded.
"Given all that you have endured, and how you have always tended toward keeping your emotions under strict regulation, it is only natural that you should explode once in a while when you have no one with whom you feel comfortable confiding in to vent upon," said he. "Shall we say no more about it?"
"You are very good, Uncle," Darcy replied. "Now, you said in your note that you wished to discuss Pemberley, but thought it best to do so in person."
"Yes, I suppose it is best we have done with it, so that your mood is calmer when your sister rises," said Lord Disley. "She has been looking forward to having you here since I told her you were coming."
"I am sorry to have stayed away so long. I simply thought it for the best."
"I understand that, and she will as well, in time."
His uncle then shifted some papers on his desk about, seemingly looking for one or more in particular. When at last he found what he was looking for, he held the sheets out to Darcy.
"That,"
he said, as Darcy took the 2 pages of paper in hand,
"is a plan for returning at least some of your fortune to you. It will take some time before the estate can be solvent again, but it's doable."
Darcy frowned as the full meaning of what he was reading registered. It was a business plan for leasing Pemberley.
"You want to let Pemberley? Pemberley in the hands of other people?"
he said, not bothering to keep the incredulity he felt from his voice.
"Fitzwilliam, you forget, perhaps, that not only was much of the Darcy fortune lost to those wretched Wickhams, but also that your father spent what they didn't take trying to find them, not to mention his desperate attempts to recoup his losses through gambling and bad investments,"
Lord Disley pointed out.
"It is a miracle that your sister's dowry was saved. The rent from Pemberley's tenants has not been enough to pay off all the debt accrued, and it's been almost 5 years. We ought to have done this from the start, but we were both of us so hopeful that those bounders and the money they took might yet be found. We were, as you are full aware, unfortunately wrong. And I can no longer justify taking no action at all regarding the estate. Something must be done, as I know you'll never agree to my selling it."
"You're damn right I won't," Darcy growled. "You may legally own Pemberley at present, Uncle, but that house, that land, and their history belong to Georgiana and me."
"Precisely my point," Disley retorted. "Nor would I wish to take it away from you. As you said, it's all you have left, and I do want to be able to place ownership of the estate back into the hands in which it belongs. I'd have done so before now, but with the state of your father's affairs, I did not wish to chance his debtors trying to claim it piecemeal."
"And for that, Uncle, I do thank you. Despite the collateral damage done by my father giving up the estate, I am content in the knowledge that it will one day be mine again," Darcy replied. "You have saved it for me, and I am grateful."
"I haven't the ability to manage Disley as well as Pemberley on my income. I'm rich, Fitzwilliam, but sadly not that rich," his uncle continued. "With a yearly lease in place, asking as much as can legally be asked, and perhaps a little more, we can put that much more of the tenants' rents toward the debt. A trifling amount in comparison, but still something. You'll at least get your 10,000 a year back, which is a vast deal better than what I've been able to give you."
A vast deal better indeed. 10,000 a year would be a far cry from the 500 he now lived under. And having Pemberley as his own once again, though up to half his income would be spent on maintaining the house and grounds and seeing to the needs of the tenants, would be eminently preferable to what he made do with at present. He could pay Reynolds and his wife a salary again. He could get them help for carrying out their daily tasks. They could delegate to maids and footmen as they had done before. And he just might go back to shaving more than once a week. Darcy lifted the papers in his hands as he asked, "What, pray, is your projection for solvency?" His uncle sat back again.
"Unless by some miracle the money stolen by your father's steward and his son is found, 3 to 5 years."